A very good evening. The Rivonia Trial is a prominent part of South African history. Many of those who were on trial are now leading political figures, including the President, Nelson Mandela. Well, the man who defended the trialists, advocate Bram Fischer, died 20 years ago. Tomorrow, President Mandela delivers the first of the Bram Fischer Memorial Lectures in Johannesburg. So tonight, Agenda explores the life of Bram Fischer in this special documentary. It was produced by Jill Engelbrecht and Marianne de Villiers, with camera work by Luke Partington and the editing by Thomas Krantz.
In 1964, Bram Fischer wrote in an article published in the London Observer,
"A peaceful transition can be brought about if the government agrees to negotiate with all sections of the people, and in particular with the leaders at present jailed on Robben Island or in exile."
With hindsight, one can recognize the prophetic quality of these words. But at the time, Bram Fischer rocked the very foundations of the dominant nationalist government. He had to be stopped. The young Bram Fischer grew up in the wide open spaces of the Free State on a farm near Bloemfontein. When he was born in 1908, nobody would have dreamed that he would one day be labeled as a traitor to his people. His family had high hopes for him. After all, his grandfather, Bram Fischer, was a cabinet minister in the Union of South Africa. His father, Pieter Ulrich Fischer, was the judge-president of the Free State. His mother, Ella, was a member of the prominent Fichard clan of Bloemfontein.
One mustn't forget that the background of Bram and of his parents and the family where he was born and the history of the Fischers and the Steyn, that was the background of Afrikaner people who were struggling for the justice of the Afrikaner as an oppressed minority.
He was an Afrikaner at heart, and he remained that right till the end.
I think that he felt that put a particularly heavy mantle on his shoulders, even more than, to other activists in certain ways, because he felt it was really important that people should see that an Afrikaner could also be committed to justice and in this country.
I guessed something about the agony and the pain of his own heart, not in breaking away from Afrikanerdom, but in being true to his deepest convictions, which he felt, and yet not wanting to estrange the Afrikaner community.
He believed that the Afrikaners, above all, should have understood the leaders of the African and other people in South Africa who had said, there comes a time when we can take no more.
Bram Fischer had a normal Afrikaans upbringing. He went to Grey College in Bloemfontein, then on to the Free State University to study law. He even played rugby for the Free State and then faced the All Blacks in 1929. On the whole, he was a model Afrikaner.
As a student at the Free State University, he joined the sort of precursor of NUSAS, was the student parliament. He was in fact the first nationalist prime minister of the student parliament. He could have travelled up a quite a steep ladder of success had he chosen that kind of path. Now, I think as far as I know Bram, that he what he did was he did because he truly believed in it as a very important, as a sort of basis of his life.
There were no limits to what he could have reached in South Africa. He was such a big man.
But when did Bram Fischer undergo this momentous change that would set him on a path removed from his fellow Afrikaners? It is thought that it must have happened sometime in the 30s. He went to Oxford in 1932 as a Rhodes Scholar, and he spent 5 years there. During that time, he toured Europe and Russia.
The security police liked to think that, he was brainwashed, or people making excuses for him liked to think that, he was whipped off to the Soviet Union and brainwashed there. In fact, he did visit the Soviet Union while he was a student, but was not terribly impressed with it. There is a letter still around. But at some stage in the late 30s, he did join the party, the Communist Party. But it was quite fashionable in those days.
He returned to South Africa in 1937 and opened his first practice in Johannesburg. He married Molly Krige and had 3 children, Ruth, Ilse and Paul. By 1946, he was chairman of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. When the nationalist government came into power in 1948, the Communist Party started feeling the pressure. The party was banned in the early 50s, and both Molly and Bram Fischer were served with banning orders.
And the same year that he was banned, in 51 or 2, I think it was 52, he took silk. So he had a letter from the Minister of Justice, who was Blackie Swart, one letter saying, I'm banning you because you're a lousy communist, and the other letter saying, congratulations, you're now, well, it was a Queen's Counsel in those days, a senior advocate. And I mean, those were the kind of anomalies of the life.
The early banning orders were quite mild and essentially meant that the Fischers were not allowed to practice politics. Their social life, however, was not affected.
The Fischer house was about the most sociable house one could visit.
Our lives were so different at home from our peers. Our school friends certainly never had multiracial parties and people of all colours swimming in their swimming pools.
And whenever there was a party at Bram's house, somehow or the other, the word justice was spread. You couldn't have a private party at the Fischers.
I think our parents were very careful to try to explain everything to us so that we could understand that they had certain values, and they certainly explained them in a way that we understood them and accepted them.
Meanwhile, Bram was instrumental in reforming the Communist Party, this time as an underground organization.
I think we'd always known, we'd always been told that sooner or later our parents would be arrested.
To me, they were a unique couple. Very seldom in my lifetime have I met a couple whom I could compare with that couple. I find it difficult to speak about the one without the other. They complemented each other in many ways, and they were the most remarkable human beings.
I had an experience of their closeness and of their great love, because every evening Molly waited for Bram's phone call, and she was like a young girl in her first experiences of love. It was terribly touching, waiting for Bram to come back.
She was as adamant a human rights activist as he.
In June 1955, the Congress of the People adopted the Freedom Charter at Kliptown.
Both he and my mother could not attend the Congress of the People, which was in 1955, because of their banning orders. So we went and stood on a kopje near Kliptown and watched it from there, because they couldn't be part of it. But I think they'd been quite involved in the planning. And then, of course, that action led, the Congress of the People led to the treason trial of the initially 156 people, and then it was a smaller group that actually saw it through. And Bram defended that, the accused in that trial. And of course they were all acquitted in 1961. He had a very, very busy commercial practice as well. And that was the mainstay of his livelihood, and so he certainly was a successful lawyer in that context, as well as then doing the human rights sort of work as well.
I think that Bram was an outstanding advocate. He was an outstanding representative of the bar at its best.
As a lawyer, when he found that there was a choice between justice and the rigidity of the law, he'll choose justice.
The treason trial dragged on for 5 years, and it was punctuated by a difficult period for the Fischer family.
It had been interrupted with a state of emergency in 1960, when Molly was detained for 3 months, which was a very difficult period for Bram, because he was trying to defend these people. He was very distressed that she was arrested, and we didn't know when, how long it would go on for. It was indefinite detention, and it was the first of the indefinite detentions, so we were really, quite distressed by it.
When the treason trial drew to a close in 1961, Bram continued his underground political work.
There was the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe. From what conversations I had, Bram was not in favor of the violence, but when this decision was taken, he went along with it. And I didn't think, regretted it afterwards. I think he thought it was the right decision.
Of his involvement with Umkhonto we Sizwe, Bram Fischer said in 1966,
I had no hand in the founding of Umkhonto, and I have never been a member. I became aware of its existence, and I did not disapprove.
But soon the security branch raided the Lilies Leaf farm in Rivonia.
When we got arrested on the 11th of July 1963, it's just by chance that Bram missed that arrest.
He had been at Rivonia quite often, and it was just fortuitous that he was not there on the day that the people were arrested. And he didn't want to defend the Rivonia trialists at all, but was persuaded to do so because he was an Afrikaner and because he could argue on the basis of somebody who understood a people's struggle for a birthright.
The most remarkable thing about that was his courage in leading the defense in the Rivonia trial when he personally had been involved and at any moment could himself have been in the dock with the others.
After the trial, it became apparent that Bram was part of the underground that actually met at Rivonia trial. Many of our colleagues condemned him for taking the trial. He should not have been associated with it at all once he had personal knowledge of the happenings.
8 accused were sentenced to life imprisonment on Robben Island. Among them were Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki and Ahmed Kathrada. At the time, many people had expected the death sentence.
It was Bram Fischer who saved our lives. John Balthazar Foster would have been very happy to see us end.
The day after the Rivonia trial, the day after it finished, they were coming down to Cape Town, partly to see me because it was my birthday, and partly to see the accused, to discuss with him whether they should appeal. The accused had already been moved to the island. And my mother was killed in a crash on the way down.
Bram came to see us at Robben Island to consult with us.
Well, that's a very tragic thing. I sometimes don't have words to describe that. He had lost his wife. And I remember I asked the question, where's Molly? Almost in tears without showing it. I can't remember now where he said Molly was, but he refused to answer the question directly. What he did in the situation, he instructed, the commanding officer to tell us about the death of Molly when he was already gone.
The way that he bore that sorrow of his was an example to all. It was almost what one could call noble grief. No unnecessary emotion, but still very, clearly grieving and sorrowing for her, without making his own sorrow a burden to those around him.
After the break, the second part of our documentary. Now we continue with that special documentary on the life of Bram Fischer.
In July 1964, Bram Fischer was detained for 3 days under the 90-day clause of the General Law Amendment Act.
And then in about September he was arrested and charged under the Suppression of Communism Act.
While awaiting trial, Fischer was asked to handle an appeal case before the British Privy Council in London. He asked for bail. He told the magistrate,
"I have no intention of avoiding a political prosecution. I fully believe I can establish my innocence. I am an Afrikaner. My home is South Africa. I will not leave South Africa because my political beliefs conflict with those of the government ruling the country."
And so he had bail and he went to England, where quite a lot of pressure was put on him to remain out of the country.
But he said no, he'd given his word and he was going to return.
He came back to the country to lead it, to lead the struggle.
Oh, I knew he would come back. And I wasn't very surprised when he dodged bail, because he did it not for the purpose of own protection, but for the purpose of carrying on the cause he was fighting for.
When Fischer skipped bail during his trial, he wrote a letter to his counsel, Advocate H. Hansen, who read it to the court. In it, he said,
"These are my reasons for absenting myself from court. If by my flight I can encourage even some people to think about, to understand and to abandon the policies they now so blindly follow, I shall not regret any punishment I may incur. I can no longer serve justice in the way I have attempted to do during the past 30 years. I can do it only in the way I have now chosen. Finally, I would like you to urge upon the court to bear in mind that if it chooses to punish any of my fellow accused, it will be punishing them for holding the ideas today that will be universally accepted tomorrow."
He went underground as Douglas Black. His disguise was so successful that he even fooled his friends.
I got a taxi to take me to the shopping centre near where he was going to be found. And I went along and knocked at the front door. And then, to my horror, a maid appeared. Nobody had mentioned a maid. And I heard myself saying, "Is the master in?" She led me through, and there were these very odd garden chairs in the middle of the hall, and there was an ashtray with a pipe in it, and I thought, but Bram doesn't smoke. And then I heard a cough behind me, and I looked around, and there was this strange man with an auburn beard and bald with auburn hair, staring at me, and I thought, good God, I've come to the wrong house. How can I get out of this? And then he said, "Good God, Mary."
During this period underground, Bram Fischer's name was removed from the roll of advocates.
The thing that hurt him most, I think, in all that time was the Transvaal Bar Council disbarring him.
He was underground from the end of January to the middle of November. But because all the political organizations had been smashed in that time, there was very little support for him.
The whole leadership was either in prison or in exile. There was hardly anybody of the stature of Fischer in the country, so that more and more people looked upon him as the political leader in the country. And he was doing a wonderful job that way.
He was captured when somebody who knew where he was had been really quite badly tortured.
I think it was the 11th of November 1965 that he was arrested. It was a tremendous blow to our struggle.
Oh, then they threw the book at him. Then it was being a member of the National High Command, and you name it.
He was charged on 15 counts ranging from sabotage to fraud to contravening the Suppression of Communism Act. During the trial on March the 28th, 1966, Bram Fischer made a 3.5-hour statement from the dock in the Pretoria Supreme Court. In it, he said,
"When the laws themselves become immoral and require the citizen to take part in an organized system of oppression, if only by his silence or apathy, then I believe that a higher duty arises. This compels one to refuse to recognize such laws."
When they were summing up, they were asking for the death sentence. I mean, we suddenly, the three of us, turned to each other with horror as the state wound up their case and realized that they were actually asking for the death sentence.
But he was sentenced to life imprisonment and sent to the Pretoria maximum security prison.
Of course, it was apartheid years, so the white men were kept separate from the black men, so he didn't go to Robben Island.
The prison authorities, I think being lent on by the security police, treated Bram very badly, right from the time that he came in. They regarded him and took it out on him as the groot verraaier, if you like. He was the betrayer.
Prison warders tried desperately to break Bram. I mean, he was put to cleaning lavatories and scrubbing floors and really, was really put upon very hard.
And they would almost treat him as an animal. He was something when they had visitors. They would show Bram off, ons het hom, hier is hy, here's Bram. Kom Brampie, kom Brampie.
One day was to prove particularly traumatic for Bram. Hugh Lewin, who was in prison with him at the time, wrote a poem about that day. This is an extract.
But just before supper, he was called unexpectedly for a visit, which means, I said, either something good or something bad. So he missed supper with us, and we took his mealie to his cell to eat after his visit, either something good or something bad. It was like any other day. His brother, peering through the perspex into the wooden box, told him, "Your son died this morning." Through the perspex into the wooden box, keeping the state secure. "Your son died this morning." His supper, I suppose, was cold by the time he got back to his cell, alone after lockup for the next 14 hours, like any other day.
And then Bram Fischer became ill.
They wouldn't treat him. He broke his hip in the shower, and finally I married to a doctor, and it was only after we'd written a whole lot of letters that they actually treated him properly. That's when the secondaries appeared.
And cancer was confirmed.
I was already in jail, but the stories came to us. And the brutal manner in which those who had brought him to jail treated him, even when he was so sick, even when it didn't require any particular measure of intelligence to have known that Bram's life was coming to an end.
Finally, the authorities, under pressure from overseas, relented and allowed Bram to go to his brother's house to die.
He wasn't officially released. He was still a prisoner, and all prison conditions applied, that in terms of the Prisons Act, any place could be declared a prison. So they declared his brother's house in Bloemfontein a prison.
I visited him there shortly before his death. And I can quite remember that sunny afternoon, it was an afternoon, we were sitting in Paul's drawing room. There was Bram of old, emaciated, certainly, and worn, but still that personality and character came shiningly through. And I can even remember the type of soet cookies we had for tea. it was imprinted on my memory. And when I said goodbye to him that afternoon, both he and I knew it was going to be the last time, but neither of us mentioned it. We greeted each other, tot ziens. So we'll see each other again shortly.
But soon, Bram died. He was cremated in Bloemfontein in May 1975. The service was attended by about 80 people of all races. The only speaker was Mr. Justice Arthur Chaskelson, then an advocate. He said Bram Fischer had engaged in a struggle for equality and freedom from domination, a struggle for an end to racialism and a building of socialism.
You know, and of course with hindsight, as we all have now, what a waste. What an utter waste. I mean, of lots of people's lives.
Bram Fischer, a short man, with a sort of a rolling movement. And laughed easily where there was a joke.
But what I really remember about him is that fine personality he had. That refined, if one can define him, I'd say he was a Stradivarius of a man.
Very humble. Modest. Most modest are very, I come across very few people who are as modest as Bram Fischer.
He was held in very high regard by all people right across the political spectrum.
I didn't share his politics, but I knew that Bram would never do anything that he didn't firmly and completely believe in. He was, I think, one of the most breathtakingly honest people I've ever seen.
20 years after his death, the non-racial South African society which Bram Fischer believed in, fought for and went to jail for, has become a reality. But his dream of a communist state has had to make way for democracy.
That's all we have for you this evening. A very good night.